Welcome all to those who have joined us for this press conference organized by the NGO Forum on ADB with all our collaborators and members. We would have liked this to be a kind of press conference where we announce to the world that ADB is bringing out a new policy. We have engaged with them quite vigorously on it. And look, they've actually listened to us. And we are expecting a better policy than what we had, but unfortunately that is not the case. The NGO Forum did bring out a policy in May 2021. We were expecting it for a long time because the Internal Evaluation Department had said that there needs to be a serious rejig of the 2009 policy. And therefore, we were looking forward because there were some progressive statements in the advice of the IED. We were happy in the beginning because there seemed to be a coal ban, but there are still so many gaps and lacunas that we had to keep pushing at them from May. And we were also unhappy that the draft policy that came out, and they call it Energy Policy Supporting Low Carbon Transition in Asia and the Pacific. So we were surprised that it came out only in English. So as you know, most communities across Asia and the Pacific struggle a little with that language. And if what they said is true, that they were rolling out these draft policies so that they could have meaningful consultations with stakeholders, as they call us, across the regions that they're engaged in. We would expect the policy drafts to be in several major Asian languages at least, and also in Braille, etc. We thought that they would then go back based on our feedback and on all the nitty-gritties of the policy. We have today several people who are going to be briefing you perhaps on what was said before, because with the new working draft that has come out on the 16th of August, which is the second draft and really the final draft before the public, we see that the gaping holes still remain, that it doesn't seem Paris aligned enough, even though that ostensibly was the reason to have a policy review and a new policy. So here we come together where many of our speakers are longtime watchers of the bank. They understand energy issues, they speak up for their communities, and of course, they understand the climate science and that is needed to go into such an energy policy of a bank that has far-reaching impacts on the ground. And so they have wrestled with the two drafts and they come to you with that understanding, speaking up on behalf of impacted communities and those to be impacted across South, Southeast, and Central Asia. Unfortunately, some of what we are saying could be the same as what we were saying before when the first draft came in, because obviously the ADB has not listened keenly enough or has chosen not to. And so we come back with an even greater push. We know that on Monday next, September 6th, the ADB's board of directors are set to sit down and discuss the proposed policy framework that will really guide the ADB's energy portfolio over the next, I would say 5 years, even though some people are saying, oh, it's just 3-4 years, it doesn't matter. The idea that they have is of rolling it out in time for COP26 in November. So by October, we are going to have a brand new policy. It will not come back into public purview. We have the working paper, which we saw in a very short window period from the 16th to the 31st of August. As I said, the board is supposed to sit on it in a couple of days. We want the board and the bank to really listen keenly to what we are saying. And therefore, this rather rushed press conference that we're so happy that so many of you have been able to join. We have, why do we say nothing short of a meaningful consultation is what we will settle for, is because, as we said, the paper was only in English, and surprisingly so, the working paper, the second draft, which came out for that short window period, as I said, is also amazingly and unacceptably only in English. So we accept that communities on the ground, we also have not been able to go to them and do our own translations of the draft. But we think the onus is really on the bank. After all, their projects are on the ground. We know that most of them are keeping to their project deadlines. We also know that there are slight changes in some project deadlines because of the pandemic, but it is, if the ADB had so much capacity to keep going on their projects on the ground, why could they not engage communities directly so that they could really have deep, meaningful consultations and substantive comments from communities that will be impacted by their policy? So we are saying also, of course, that the bigger pandemic is the continuous pandemic, which is the climate emergency that we are in. We have a new IPCC report. Where is the tearing hurry to come out right now, make these final decisions on 6th of September and come up with the policy by end September? We think that the ADB must pause, reflect on how it has handled this review up till now, and go forward with caution. We have a stellar line of speakers. We have Avril de Torres from Seed Philippines, Hassan Mehdi from Clean Bangladesh, Tanya Lee Roberts from the NGO Forum on ADB, and she is our energy campaigner, Nora Sausmikat from Urgewald in Germany, Yobel Novian Putra from Gaia, Asia Pacific, Peg, I wish it was a keg, but Peg Putt from Biomass Working Group, Gary Lee, International Rivers, and Petra Shell from RECOS. Very simple house rules. We all know that we've been in Zoom now for a year and a half. Microphones on mute unless you have questions for our speakers. You may, of course, use the chat box for your questions or comments. We will entertain all your questions and put them to the speakers after all the speakers have spoken. And if you want to raise questions during the question and answer session, you can just raise your hand and we will pass on the mic to you. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. And I will introduce each speaker as we go along. So our first speaker is from the Center for Energy, Ecology and Development, called SEED, based in the Philippines. Avril de Torres is the head of the Research, Policy and Law program at SEED, where she leads action researches and policy engagements and manages strategic legal interventions to advance transformative energy, ecological justice, and people-centered development. SEED has actually, most importantly, authored the paper, leaving behind ADB's Dirty Energy Legacy, which was published by the NGO Forum on ADB. So Avril will talk about the most important messages that we have been speaking of for some time: 1.5 degrees alignment, carbon pricing. But over to you, Avril. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much, Vidya, everyone. Great. Allow me to start off with the IPCC report that was mentioned by Vidya and has been described as a code red for humanity. It found that many of the unprecedented changes we've observed in the climate are now irreversible for the next centuries to millennia. Methane is largely to blame because its influence to global warming is at least as large as that of carbon dioxide if measured in short timescales. And while the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal is not completely lost, we will still temporarily overshoot 1.5 in 2 decades' time, even in a very low GHG emissions pathway. Coming from a climate vulnerable country, which is experiencing many of these impacts today, this is a harrowing report to say the least. It seems, however, that this climate code red has fallen on deaf ears. Just a week after its release, ADB published this energy policy working paper, and it amplifies support for midstream and downstream fossil gas and retains limited support for downstream oil. In the main draft, it was mandatory that all fossil gas projects should be aligned to achieving carbon neutrality by mid-century. In the August working paper, this became optional. It says either align to 1.5 pathways or to a time set by DMCs that is consistent with their NDCs. But we know from the UNFCCC's NDC synthesis report, which was released early this year, that the combined impact of current NDCs are nowhere near 1.5. ADB also withdrew its support to the transition of the heating sector towards using electricity and RE alternatives. ADB's role now is relegated to merely ensuring that DMCs can benefit from using heat pump technology. Even the carbon price set, which is $43 per ton of carbon dioxide, it's in the bottom range of what the high-level Commission on Carbon Prices recommends for 2 degrees Celsius alignment. The Commission's recommendation is 40 to 80 by 2020 and 50 to 100 by 2030. But we want ADB to align to 1.5. So 43 is a very low carbon price. A new journal article was also published in Nature last July, which recommends at least $258 per metric ton of carbon dioxide based on an updated human mortality impacts of carbon. Finally, worth mentioning too is the energy transition mechanism in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam that's currently being studied by the bank. We are hoping to be clarified more on this because on first impression, a buyout scheme seems contradictory to the no-coal policy in the working paper, and partnering with funders of new and pipeline coal plants in the Philippines seems counter-intentional to the energy transition. So overall, ADB has all this room for fossil fuels, despite the fact that in the working paper, it already acknowledges the findings of the IEA net zero report. It even says that 1.5 path is narrow and it requires heightened sense of urgency, determination, and even massive investments in clean and efficient technologies. So our message to ADB is simple. First, take a step back and listen to the climate code red. The energy policy review process cannot and should not keep a pace without taking into account this critical IPCC report. The report cannot be glossed over simply because it was released at the tail end of this review process. There is a more urgent and global climate timeline we are trying to meet. This working paper then should be revised and circulated again for consultations, but this time with the key findings of the IPCC report integrated and with express alignment with the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris goal in its entire energy operations. Remaining vague on this temperature goal will lead ambiguity to the types that should be supported and speed of decarbonization that has to happen and the carbon budget we have left. We also want to remind ADB that the IPCC's 2018 special report on global warming of 1.5 says that meeting 1.5 means several 100 million fewer people will be exposed to climate-related risks and susceptible to poverty. Finally, we call on ADB to close the door on all fossil fuels. The IPCC report says we need strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in methane emissions, and that points to fossil gas and oil in the energy sector. We need ADB to take on the greatest ambition and ramp up support for long-term RE alternatives instead of short-term alternatives that can perpetuate fossil fuel dependence, create barriers eventually, or even crowd out RE. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Avril, for pointing out again that we are in a climate emergency. Code Red has been sounded, and the ADB needs to do much more and go back perhaps a bit to their policy draft. Our next speaker is Hassan Mehdi from Bangladesh. In light of what Avril just told us, remember the ADB undertook this whole exercise of updating their policy and reviewing it after the Independent Evaluation Department of the bank issued what they call the sector-wide evaluation report on ADB Energy Policy and Program 2009 to 19. And that was in August 2020, and it highlighted that while fossil gas, that they call, of course, natural gas, could be considered a transition fuel towards a low carbon economy, it still contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll call upon Hassan Mehdi from Bangladesh to tell us more. He's a human rights and environmental activist and the chief executive of CLEAN, which is Coastal Livelihood and Environmental Action Network, situated in Khulna in Bangladesh, right next to the huge Sundarbans. His sector is climate change, mangrove forests and biodiversity, environmental education, and agriculture. He's member secretary of the Bangladesh Working Group on External Debt, which is a civil society platform working on mega projects financed by bilateral and multilateral financial institutions. Mehdi is currently the International Committee chairperson of the NGO Forum on ADB. Mehdi, especially on fossil gas and the reliance on imported fossil fuels in Bangladesh and across Asia. The new chair of the NGO Forum. Yes.
Thank you, Vidya, for long introduction, which is not.
You are not very short in what you do, and therefore it was mandated.
Yeah. Thank you very much. My presentation, my speech is very short, and I try to make it, as short as I can. Dear journalists, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Bangladesh. In this era of digital meetings and digital press conferences, we are really unsure that where you are, staying. So, the Asian Development Bank is not merely a financial institute, but also a policy influencing agencies for the developing member countries, DMCs in Asia and the Pacific. So if the energy policy doesn't focus on exiting the fossil fuels, how will the developing member countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, or India can ensure 100% renewables by 2050, as mentioned by several international agencies and multilateral agencies? So knowing the situation, we noticed that energy policy doesn't have any set deadline to end fossil fuel investment. Thus, the fossil fuel financing under the policy is actually, it is saying that it's transitional, but it's actually a never-ending process. So when I looked into the document, I think that whether ADB is also like a bad commercial bank who are like climate deniers. It is focusing on gas now from the coal, especially the liquefied fossil gas, which is called LNG in their official documents. But LNG transportation, regasification, transmission, and then other midstream and downstream business of that gas emits more than the actual emission of utilizing this fossil gas. That 80 to 85% of the fossil gas is simply methane, and methane can hold 28 times more heat than the carbon dioxide does. And methane is responsible for more than 20% of global emission now. So from that aspect, methane is more dangerous than any other greenhouse gases. Besides, liquefied fossil gas is so expensive that in poor communities like in Asian countries, in Bangladesh or Cambodia or India or Indonesia, don't have the capability to afford it. Market volatility made it more unpredictable. In 2020, it's fluctuated 1,000% in a single year. As an example, LNG-based power is simply 7 times costlier than domestic fossil gas in Bangladesh, and it's 6 times more expensive than solar power in India. So it is expensive like furnace oil, and more than furnace oil, and equal to diesel in developing countries. So if they approve a gas-based project now, it will come into operation by 2051 or 2052, after 40 months of construction period and preparation. So to make it economically viable, it has to run for 23 to 25 years. So the natural retirement date will be like after 2050 years. So we are not going to, we will not be able to ensure even net zero by 2050, let alone the real zero. And in this after 2020, the renewable price of renewable energy is like cheaper than any other fossil fuels in especially South Asia and Southeast Asia. So why do they need to invest more for fossil fuels like fossil gas and LNG? So if they can set a target of ending fossil fuel investment and ensuring 100% renewables in Asia Pacific, that will help to protect our planet, our people, and economy. Otherwise, not. Thank you, dear great fighters in the media. Bye bye.
Thank you, Mehdi. Yes, thank you for sounding the alarm. And we also know that the ADB has been pushing several projects, and also it's like a big player that pushes our energy policies within countries, in Bangladesh, in India, etc. So whatever they do put in their energy policy has really far-reaching impacts on the ground, because our governments tend to listen to all multilateral development banks, but especially in Asia, the ADB. And therefore, our next speaker works to shift ADB and AIB's energy policy and finance priorities away from large-scale, resource-intensive and fossil fuel-reliant options. For several years, she has been part of community groups, CSOs, and social movements demanding accountability from financial institutions and transnational corporations for the damage and injustice wrought on local communities and ecosystems. Tanya Lee Roberts completed an undergraduate degree in feminist studies and the politics of globalization in Canada, and MA in international human rights law at the United Nations University for Peace in Costa Rica. Tanya is currently the NGO Forum on ADB's energy campaigner. And in light of all we have heard from Avril and Mehdi, she will talk about the important next push that we all need to give, which is towards just transition.
Thank you, Vidya, and thank you all for joining this press conference today. I just want to take a moment and step away from the focus on the ADB and pivot towards the actual realities of communities on the ground across the region. Whether we're talking about fisher folk and subsistence farming families along the coastlines of Bangladesh, workers, women's, indigenous peoples, and youth movements across the Philippines, Terai peoples of Nepal, coastal peoples of Indonesia, the herders of Mongolia, all have been echoing the call to keep oil, coal, and gas in the ground. We know what climate science demands of us. We know the technology and economics are clear that an energy transition towards renewables is going to be underway. But what is not clear is whether this transition will be just, inclusive, sustainable, and grounded in the realities of diverse peoples across the front lines of climate change and injustice. So when we take a look back at what the draft energy policy of the ADB suggests in relation to a just transition and how that will be deployed in member countries, what we see is that the wording in the policy is not only vague, but has no time-bound commitments. It rings hollow, furthermore, when it's held up against the internationally accepted standards of a just transition, because one key component that is clearly known about a just transition is that it means a commitment to pivot away from resource-intensive, unsustainable, fossil fuel, and resource-intensive dependent power sector projects. So that's not only coal, oil, and gas, but also more broadly, we need an energy transformation grounded in upholding people's rights and people's dignity. So when we look at the wording of the ADB's draft policy, what we see as well is that it lines up alongside provisions to finance oil, gas, and carbon capture schemes that themselves are reliant on fossil fuel operations. It lines up against provisions that are for large hydro, for destructive waste to energy projects, and a whole range of other resource-intensive concerning types of investments. So it is not clear how, when the ADB speaks of a just transition and plans for supporting that in member countries, how it will be applied to their own existing and financed coal, oil, and gas sites, or how such plans will be grounded in the realities, the concerns, and demands of people affected by these projects, or thirdly, how it will even uphold core labor and human rights standards, or more stringently, the ADB's own safeguard policies. And so on these accounts, at a very minimum from our side, we would call on the ADB to explicitly drop financing for new oil and gas projects and clearly screen financial intermediaries to make sure that none of these modalities are exposed to coal, oil, or gas. They need to support as a priority a time-bound, overarching process for an inclusive, just transition of ADB active and closed investments in the fossil fuel sector. They must uphold international labor standards, human rights conventions, and Indigenous people's rights, including in relation to saying that this is aligned with the Paris goals, not only climate goals of 1.5 degrees Celsius, but also beyond that to extend to all the rights that are explained in the provisions of the Paris Agreement. The ADB also must ensure that there's a full application and engagement of these plans that they are discussing on just transition with communities affected by resource-intensive energy projects, including fisherfolk, Indigenous peoples, workers, youth, ethnic minorities, and across the spectrum, that attention is paid to ensure that people with disabilities, women, and other vulnerable communities are engaged. And they must unequivocally shift their focus towards locally relevant, decentralized energy solutions where communities can be actively engaged in decision-making processes to co-create their own energy futures. And so with those provisions integrated, at least at a very minimum, their suggestion of supporting a just transition for the region would ring less hollow. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. As you said, no clarity, no clear pathway towards 1.5 or just transition, no good answers to our abiding foundational questions. And there are more questions coming their way. I'll move now to Nora Sasmikat, who is also an international committee member of the NGO Forum, and she's part of Urgewald in Germany. She she's going to talk about the new flavor of the season, really, hydrogen of every hue, and is a qualified sinologist with more than 30 years of experience analyzing political reform processes in China with a special focus on environmental and human rights movements. Since September 2019, she's been working in the influential Urgewald organization based in Germany. In 2008, she co-founded the Asia House Foundation's China program, which she continued to develop and manage until 2019. In addition, she founded the EU-China NGO Twinning Program, which up until 2019 included over 140 alumni from over 20 European countries and from China. In recent years, she has increasingly focused her work on the banks and on environmental and social standards of multilateral development banks. In particular, the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the ADB, as well as on the social and ecological effects of Chinese foreign investments, especially within the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. So Nora, on to you for the questions that you have for the ADB.
Thank you, Vidya, for this very comprehensive introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning from Germany. As we have heard, fossil fuels finances have to stop now, and we need really true solutions. Alan Sharma, the COP president, says the COP26 must consign coal to history. The ADB tries to convince the public by using some vague language and some wrong solutions. Let me just highlight 3 of these wrong solutions. Firstly, hydrogen. We welcome the ADB puts the emphasis on green hydrogen. Unfortunately, this emphasis gets lost in the text of the working paper of the clean energy. This opens up the door for unsustainable ways of producing hydrogen. Only green hydrogens produced by renewable energy is sustainable and reducing carbon emissions. Blue hydrogen is explicitly mentioned in the FAQ of the working paper, and this is produced from gas, and that not a carbon neutral or carbon reducing source of energy. ADB should add the word green where hydrogen is being mentioned and make clear that only green hydrogen will be financed. Secondly, coming back to the early retirement of coal power plants, as mentioned in the working paper, and adding the German perspective. The planned scheme to buy out coal power plants is in fact prolonging the plants. Early retirement is anyway necessary for many coal power plants in Southeast Asia. The German coal exit experience and an expert report by the Energy Brain Pool Institute clearly showed the proposed buyouts postpone coal exit for many years and distort the energy market. Without compensation and rising costs for pollution rights, many power plants would die much earlier. So we demand to take all experiences made so far into account and include civil society experts in the proposed pilot countries into the designing of such schemes. And finally, thirdly, nuclear. Mentioning nuclear as carbon-friendly source of energy is expressing a very narrow view. It leaves out the ecological problems with uranium mining, as well as the still globally unresolved problem of depositing nuclear waste. Nuclear energy is much too costly and not economically. Opening the door for technical assistance, as mentioned in the FAQ of the working paper, is a very dangerous path. Under point 8 in the technical assistant, under point 8 of the FAQ, it is said, I quote, should a client find that nuclear offer significant benefits as a part of their energy mix, ADB may consider nuclear energy as part of that DMC's energy strategy, and ADB may provide technical assistance related to planning long-term policies that include nuclear energy. From almost 30 years of experience with IFIs, we at Urgewald know that technical assistances, including nuclear, will in the end help fostering nuclear projects through advice for legislation, bringing financiers in, etc. So we demand that this option clearly has to be scrapped from the energy policy of the ADB. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. That was very clear. Nuclear energy is dangerous, must be scrapped. And well, all the ADB seems to be pushing even now is fossil fuels, fossil gas, and false solutions, which brings me to our next speaker. Yobel Novian Putra is the Climate and Clean Energy Campaign Associate for Gaia, Asia Pacific. His interest in waste issues started from learning the history of a catastrophic landfill avalanche in his hometown, Bandung, in Indonesia. Later on, his interest transformed into a passion for learning about zero waste. Before joining Gaia, Yobel worked for 2 years as zero waste policy advocacy staff at YPBB Bandung, which is a local NGO implementing zero waste cities program since 2013. He's also involved in Alliance Zero Waste Indonesia. Yobel, what do you think of the second draft, the working paper that they just closed our inputs on?
Right, Vidya, thank you. As we've seen before, since 2009 energy policy, ADB has been pushing the concept of waste to energy, or simply waste incinerator, as a clean and renewable energy source. And that hasn't changed. Despite tons of well-published feedback, meetings, letters signed by more than 70 CSOs globally, ADB doesn't change, doesn't budge. In the working paper on paragraph 71, the provision related to waste to energy failed to reflect critical concerns related to ADB management since December last year. First of all, for a policy that promises to support low carbon transition in Asia Pacific, ADB has failed to acknowledge the science of waste incineration. Science has clearly shown that waste incineration is not low carbon investment. And studies also have shown that waste to energy incinerators emit more carbon than coal-fired power plants. It also costs more than coal-fired power plants per megawatt hour produced. In fact, it's 3 times more expensive than true renewable sources such as solar and wind. Even in its FAQ on energy policy, ADB agrees that energy generation potential of waste to energy is viewed as a byproduct, a secondary priority. So it doesn't make sense to get coal-fired power plant phased out, yet ADB plans to support investment in incineration technology, which is costlier both financially and environmentally. Socially, it's also generates the least jobs compared to other activities, even compared to landfilling, making it conflict with its promises on just transition. Secondly, in paragraph 77 of the working paper, ADB classifies waste as renewable energy sources. This clearly contradicts with the IPCC directive. The directive states that only the organic component of municipal solid waste is considered as renewable. Yet the policy considers the broad category of waste, including fossil-based waste stream, such as plastic, to be considered renewable. It's undeniable that these facilities rely heavily on fossil-based plastic. To avoid 1.5 Celsius global temperature increase, all types of fossil fuel should be banned, including plastic. With fossil fuels running out of market, then plastic is the runaway strategy for oil companies. especially in Asia, where the production is continuously increasing. And waste to energy bind the government in a debt contract for 20 to 30 years. Contractually, local cities have to supply huge volume of waste for this period or risk becoming indebted. This arrangement also hinders countries' top priority targets of waste reduction, reuse, and recycling. We can learn from mainland China, South Korea's waste incinerator. As the waste separation rate is increasing there, their facilities are having overcapacity issues and competing for recyclables. The W paper also fails to recognize that waste to energy incineration does not eliminate landfill, especially in small islands where building toxic ash landfill pose a huge risk of rising sea level, as indicated by the IPCC 6th annual report. If which country cannot cope, it's reasonable that waste to energy should not be an investment option in poor countries. With this fact, waste incineration will make countries have a difficult time to achieve neither their net zero target nor be Paris aligned. Lastly, the working paper provides weak environmental and social impact mitigation using unclear standard. It only states that ADB will use the best technology available in the design and operation. It's concerning that provisions are silent on international obligation and standards relevant to mitigating the risks of WTE. And it relies heavily on national law and corporate policies, which have been proven by independent ADB evaluations to be weak and insufficient in addressing these concerns. For this very reason, communities in Maldives, India, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand are currently fighting waste incinerator project. And the current working paper has also omitted the provision of guidance note on waste to energy. In the May version, it's there. The draft states that the guidance note will only be meant for staff and not made available for public. However, we believe this should be made public. The bank should be transparent and let CSOs involved in the development process as well. Without it, the risky investment of waste to energy will become even more risky for local communities, our Earth, and even ADB itself. Waste to energy is a waste of energy at the global level. It heats up our planet, wastes our limited time and public money to avoid the worst climate emergency scenario of ecological collapse. ADB should exclude waste to energy incinerator from all financing policies and support true renewable energy solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Yobel. And I know Gaia as a group really lobbied hard with the ADB to get them to listen to their concerns. Unfortunately, we haven't had much success with that. Hopefully the board will listen more keenly and we will have them take up these issues, which is why we are calling this press conference, because we are really keen that our critical concerns are actually brought onto the table when the board sits on the 6th of September. Thank you, Yobel. I will go to our next speaker. And interestingly, that is also a solution for many people. Just like waste to energy seems like a really good idea for even ordinary people in our countries. Biomass also and bioenergy seems like a very good idea to many. Somebody who is, quite an expert on this, Peg Putt, is going to speak to us. She lives in Tasmania in Australia and works on the Environmental Paper Network International's Forest and Climate Project. She has been CEO of Markets for Change from 2011 to 2018, has campaigned for 35 long years on forests, and is on the Tasmanian Honour Roll of Women for Service to the Environment. She was a Greens Party MP from 93 to 2008, a very long stint. So you can see the confidence that people have in what she says and does. And its leader for 10 years, prior to which she headed several conservation organizations. Peg has been working internationally on forests and climate for the last 12 years very intensively. She has an honors degree in international relations from the University of Sussex in the US. She's here as a representative regional representative of the biomass working group. So Peg, tell us, what are your concerns on large-scale bioenergy and biomass that the ADB seems to be pushing?
Thank you, Vidya. I see that I'm somehow mirror image with my screen behind. Since I'm coming from the Southern Hemisphere, that's probably better than being upside down.
But you look completely fine to us, so go ahead.
Well, that's all right then.
Yeah.
So the Asian Development Bank uncritically embraces bioenergy, apparently thinking that there are no serious issues with the scale of projects nor with the feedstock. Our concern is the large-scale use of wood from natural forests and from monoculture plantations for energy generation. This concern's acute because the policy promotes extensive use of Indigenous resources. You're no doubt thinking that I'm going to go to the adverse impacts on forests and on local communities, and I'll come to that. But first, a primary fundamental concern is that burning forest biomass is as emissive as burning coal, and frequently more emissive than burning coal. Why would you finance a transition to there rather than to genuine low emissions energy sources? Clearly, we need to be out of coal and fossil fuels, but to address climate change and to chime in with what the previous speaker just said from Gaia, we need to go beyond burning. There's a strong body of opinion that forest biomass should not even be classified as renewable. It exacerbates the climate crisis at a critical time, and there's no possibility that the carbon emissions can be drawn down by regrowing the forests inside of the Paris timelines for action. It's actually making the crisis worse during that period. And there's an assumption in there that the forest would ever actually be allowed to regrow to where it was before. And that's very unlikely to happen. It's not the usual situation. So the first point is that actually burning forest biomass on a large scale exacerbates the climate crisis, and the best use of forests to address the climate change is to let them keep growing and keep on absorbing carbon. Because if you cut them and burn them, you actually not only add immediately emissions to the atmosphere, but you undermine their ability to help combat climate change. Secondly, of course, it's injurious to biodiversity, where natural forest is concerned, and also where we see conversion of natural ecosystems, including forests, to monoculture plantations. The ADB does mention sustainability criteria, but that's just by way of window dressing. It's totally inadequate. For a start, sustainability criteria address forest management, but not greenhouse gas emissions, so that they're completely silent on the climate impact. But also, they're simply not capable of restraining large-scale use of forests, because this use is actually another driver coming into play, affecting forest deforestation and forest degradation. Plantation feedstocks are at the expense of communities and livelihoods and biodiversity, often affecting the most marginalised communities. Air pollution is completely unrecognised by the ADB. They note it for internal inside household burning of biomass, but apparently don't understand that large-scale biomass generators also generate a huge amount of air pollution, at least as bad as what you get from coal. And then we have a big question mark around the transition out of coal if it involves co-firing with biomass, because it's been shown in Europe that actually introducing co-firing as a transition solution entrenches the use of coal. This is a really very real concern when you have Indonesia under a presidential decree to convert 52 coal-fired power stations to co-firing with biomass. The ADB also seems to support CCS, and we suspect that that might mean, although they're not clear, that they support bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Now, the IPCC warned against this at a large scale. It just has massive impacts on food security, on water, desertification, just a range of issues, marginalisation and dispossession of communities, the works, and they shouldn't be getting into it. So to summarise our submission to the ADB, we submit that biomass sourced at volume from natural forests and from plantations is problematic for both climate and biodiversity, as well as for local communities, and must not form part of the ADB's energy policy preferences. Large-scale burning of forest biomass for energy is not acceptable as part of a renewable energy portfolio. Thank you.
Thanks, Beck. That was very, very clear. No more false solutions in the name of biomass energy. Not just that the ADB keeps fossil fuels in the ground, but they stay away from forests. Reforestation and restoration efforts of forests never quite measure up to the positive impact that virgin forests have on the climate emergency that is upon us. And so really keep away from the forests, and while tree planting, etc., and afforestation may be very well-meaning, and a lot of us think that is the way to be, to keep planting trees, etc., it's really no solution. We'll go on to something else that is also seen as a solution. Gary Lee is someone who warns us very, very strongly about it. He talks of how support for new greenfield hydro, large hydro, is not in line with the priorities or stated priorities of the ADB. Gary oversees International Rivers Southeast Asia program, and is based in the Mekong. He has 13 years of experience in providing technical and advocacy support to and strengthening collaborations between civil society organizations and river networks in the Mekong region. Prior to joining International Rivers, Gary Lee was policy advisor for Oxfam's Mekong Watch governance program. He has a bachelor's degree in political economy with honors in geography from the University of Sydney. And he's been a strong voice of advocacy with the NGO Forum. Gary, yes, there you are.
Okay, thank you, Vidya, for the generous introduction. I'll try and keep this brief. I mean, main thing I'd like to highlight is large-scale hydropower is a false solution and is an obstacle for the ADB in meeting its commitments, both under its overarching strategy, the Strategy 2030, and some of its key commitments under its energy policy. So the current draft of the energy policy, I'd like to just draw on a few points. One, it recognizes that the impacts of climate change and also importantly, disruption of ecosystems can have severe impacts on livelihoods and food security, which in turn can undermine health. It also includes a commitment, the current working paper includes a commitment for ADB to conduct the energy sector activities and operations in line with principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusiveness. It also has a stated objective that where it wants to help its developing member countries to develop more sustainable and resilient energy systems, which also includes, as part of that support, avoiding energy options that damage or result in negative environmental impacts. So if the Asian Development Bank is genuine about these principles and commitments, it must rule out supporting new large-scale hydropower projects. Why? There are many, many reasons why, but I just want to focus on a few key ones. So firstly, the legacy of hydropower projects in Asia, including projects that have been funded by the ADB, highlights how large-scale hydropower projects have exacerbated inequality, reduced resilience to climate change, and undermined local food security and local economies. There is a recognition of that even by the ADB itself in other studies. So the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank have been collaborating in a series of studies where they're publishing climate risk profiles for individual countries. So one for Cambodia was published just last month. And one of the key messages there in that report was noting climate change and human activities, including the development of dams upstream, pose a major threat to the productivity of fisheries in the Tonle Sap and Cambodia more broadly, which in turn threatens the livelihoods and the nourishment of many poor rural communities. So they are recognizing that these developments are impacting the people that ADB wants to really support and get out of poverty, yet the current draft of the policy under paragraph 69 leaves the door open for ongoing support and promotion of large-scale hydropower under the guise of sustainability. On that point, the second reason, large hydro is not clean, nor is it sustainable. Dams, when they create reservoirs, particularly in tropical areas, are a significant source of methane emissions. And as we've heard from other speakers and citing the IPCC, which has made it clear that methane emissions is something we need to cut significantly and quickly if we are to have a fighting chance in addressing the climate crisis. Thirdly, I want to highlight large-scale hydro is actually becoming riskier and less reliable as extreme weather like flooding, intense rainfall, and extended droughts, which is being driven by climate change, is becoming more frequent. So drawing from examples in the Mekong region, in Cambodia in 2019, we saw rolling blackouts, including in the capital, because of the country's over-reliance of large-scale hydropower, which was not producing electricity because there was not enough water in the rivers. On the flip side, in 2018 and also this year, we have seen periods of intense rainfall in parts of the Mekong Basin, and where the response of some of the dam operators have been sudden release of water, which have exacerbated flooding downstream, causing significant damage to the resources and assets that are vital for communities' lives and livelihoods. So I'd like to just conclude, I think Avril started, it is code red. We are running out of time. Large dams represent a false solution and a distraction from making true progress in addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis. So ADB, in its energy policy, must exclude support for new large-scale hydropower. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, thank you. Important points made, Gary. No digression, no deflections. Solutions need to be really sustainable and people-centric. The ADB needs to bring that on board and not push through with the haste that they seem to be pushing through. Petra Shell, our next and final speaker, I think, is the campaigns manager at Recourse. Yes, she is the final speaker today. Is the campaign manager at Recourse, which is in the United Kingdom. She joined Recourse in 2018 March. Before this, she worked for the Bank Information Center and for the Bretton Woods project, where she coordinated the work on the environment, human rights, and social impacts of projects. She's previously worked at organizations such as Progressio, the New Economic Foundation, and the World Development Movement, focusing on social and environmental issues, including climate change. She's also spent a year working in Tanzania for a conservation organization. Petra holds an MSc in Development Studies from SOAS University of London, a BSc in Social Science from the University of Stockholm in Sweden, where she belongs, and a PG Diploma in Environment and Sustainability from Birkbeck, University of London. Petra Shell.
Thank you very much, Vidya, and I hope you will have some more energy just for one more topic today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about indirect finance and ADB support for that. And with that, I mean investments the bank makes through third parties like banks or private equity funds or infrastructure funds. So like many other big public bank, ADB has increased its lending. In fact, since the financial crisis, it's increased in support to the financial sector tenfold. And I'm going to mention here financial intermediaries known as FIs as a kind of shortcut for what we mean by this. Today, ADB's FI portfolio since 2009 stands at over 6 billion, supporting 86 clients. And some of you will already be familiar with problems with FI lending at such institutions, for example, as the International Finance Corporation, the World Bank's private sector arm, or IFC for short. The good news I have is that ADB's portfolio does not seem to be as bad as IFC in terms of exposure to fossil fuels. But the bad news is that ADB's FI investment is far less transparent even than the IFC's. So it's very difficult to see where the money ends up. And when we looked at these 86 FI investments, we found that nearly every single one had vital social environmental information withheld, which leads me to my first request and demand for change, which is that ADB must publish the name, sector, and location of all high and medium risk projects it supports through FIs, because otherwise it's impossible to track what happens to these FI investments, and we simply have to believe that they don't go to fossil fuels. ADB has actually shown that it is possible to have transparency. For its investment in 2018 in Creador Private Equity Fund, ADB actually did publish not only the sub-projects supported by Creador, but also detailed information about those sub-investments. But despite the good news I mentioned, we actually did find several FI investments in ADB's portfolio that do raise red flags. And I'm just going to quickly whiz you through three of them: a bank, a private equity fund, and an infrastructure fund. So as an example, ADB has invested in Axis Bank and Yes Bank in India, both of which are heavily invested in coal. Another investment is the private equity fund Clifford Capital, which is involved in, for example, oil drilling, oil shuttle tankers, gas power plants, oil power plants, and so on. And finally, Indian NGOs are very concerned about investments, including the ADB, in India's National Infrastructure Investment Fund, not the least about this partnership with NTPC, a company which runs 24 coal plants. So this leads me to a second demand to the ADB over FIs, that we must have robust exclusions for fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and gas, that apply to both ADB's direct and indirect lending. And the new draft actually does make some promising steps in this direction, saying that it will apply to both direct and indirect lending. But these provisions must be strong enough, as others have already pointed out, and in line with the goal of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. And this is particularly important as well, as ADB is increasingly emphasizing more and more support for the private sector, and also as it switches its support from coal to gas. And with this, the dangers of FI investment will only grow, so action on this issue is urgent. So to wrap up, we as Recourse join our Asian partners in solidarity, and we call on shareholders in ADB to ensure that the draft energy policy is rejected in its current form and altered to ensure it truly meets ADB's ambition, as it says, of aligning with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Petra Shell. And that's a wrap on what our speakers needed to bring to you. 8 speakers. This is the time to put forth your questions or comments and to raise your hand in case you need to be heard. As Petra said, transparency is really the cornerstone. And that's what we expect out of the energy policy and all policies. This doesn't augur well for the ADB's safeguard policy review, which is coming up very soon. And as we have said here, Nothing less than an inclusive, meaningful consultation is acceptable. FIs are like a black hole where ADB puts its money, and we do not know where that can lead us. Yes, as Jen from the forum, who's doing all our backup work, and she's our communications chief, she's our communications wizard. She said that if you have questions, you may place them here in the chat box, or you may raise your hand. Okay, Jasmine, do you want to say that? Okay, I'll just put it to you. Hi, may I know what the NGO's plans would be in case all your calls fall on deaf ears? Yes, we've been feeling frustrated already, Jasmine. And so I'll put this question to somebody who really, I was hoping he wraps up the press conference, but I think this is the right time to call him in. Ryan Hassan is the current executive director of the NGO Forum on ADB, which has hosted this press conference. He has a background in environmental studies from NSU Dhaka in Bangladesh, and a master's in social change and development from Australia. He's currently pursuing a doctorate in political science at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, as he oversees the forum's network and its campaigns. So really, he's in the best position to answer this as an anchor for the way we are pushing back at the bank on this policy. As a civil society advocate, he regularly engages policymakers at the ADB and the AIIB, and their major stakeholders and their directors who sit on the board. So he brings community issues very strongly to the forefront of the development debate. Through the support and guidance of the Forum's International Committee, he continues to forge new alliances and implements campaigns with civil society groups at local, regional, and global platforms. Ryan, what do you think? I mean, I know that all of us members of the forum would keep pushing you into pushing harder at the ADB, but what do you intend to do if they don't budge? And the circumstance right now looks like they may not budge much.
Well, first of all, thanks to all the speakers today, and thank you, Vidya, for moderating, and all the media friends that we've had in attendance, and for them to take their time to be here and listen to all the calls and issues. I think Ms. Jasmine Romero from ABS-CBN News is asking the oldest question in the world when you're trying to fight injustice, is a question of hope versus hopelessness. So in this case, if all our calls and all our claims do fall on deaf ears, this does not stop the entire global compact of climate movement and climate justice to push forward. I guess it emboldens it. It makes perfect sense that we are up against an institution which is not willing to change after 54 years of historical debacles, adding emissions into the atmosphere. So if I don't expect them to listen to our calls, honestly, I think even talking to them in the morning, I just realized that the ADB does incremental changes in the right direction, but it is not a systemic change of this bank in the way it approaches energy investment. It has loopholes for every single thing that you've put out there arguing against. So we're not naive here. There's a business interest, there is a state interest, there's a MDB public finance interest to keep business as usual. But I think the IPCC report is absolutely clear. We are derailing from 1.5. And this is a historic moment in time. Never have we faced a global health crisis as we are in now. Never have we faced $269 trillion of debt globally. And here we are trying to change the global engine from fossil fuel to true renewables. And we are a part of that struggle. So the question is not whether the call falls on deaf ears. The question is on which side of history do you want to stand on when all the cards are laid on the table? And I think the friends and allies of NGO Forum on ADB and our friends in the media, this is the time to really sharpen the pens, because the written word is going to be up for battle. It is going to be policy versus the written word. And it is the written word of the people, which should count over all policies and all corporate interests, because we are trying to save the world and humanity and the climate, not for ourselves, but for our future generations to come. So it's bigger than us. And the cause is bigger than us. And I hope our media friends can pay heed to that and really help us in pushing this bank towards the right direction. I think our IC chair.
Thanks. Yes, Hassan Mehdi, chairperson of the NGO Forum, wants to pipe in. Yes,
just a single line, Jasmine. When a project is destructive for the people and the environment, the people raise their own voices for their for their survival. And ADB has had that policy to support coal power plants and coal mines, and people in Fulbari in Bangladesh raised their voices, sacrificed their lives to save their environment and survive existence. So ADB had to stop that project in 2006. So that's the addition which I have.
So the pushback from the ground will very much be there. And but there are still questions in even some people in our country, and Marna Velasco, I think, is articulating that. For a country that has dilemmas of power supply tightening and shortages, like in the Philippines, can coal phase out be a really feasible solution, she asks. I'll pass it on to Avril de Torres of SEED Philippines to answer this, because they're the ones who've done the research, who look closely and have proffered not false solutions, but real solutions. Yes, Avril.
Yes, thanks for that question to our friend Mirna. SEED authored actually a report that was published by NGO Forum last month. It's entitled Switching on Transformative Energy, and it's available on our website as well as NGO Forum's website. And there we talked about the Luzon grid red alert. And we also have this other paper, the Philippine fossil gas landscape, which talks about the nearing depletion of the Malampaya gas field and what that means for the country. And in these reports, we analyze that the root problem for the recent red alert points largely to coal plants that are obsolete and old and have been conking out frequently every year, every summer. Part of that also is NGCP's delay in transmission projects, which had they been developed in time, that could have allowed for oversupply in other islands like Negros to be transmitted to Luzon and to supply that gap from coal plants going on unplanned outages. But we also pointed to the failure of government to regulate private power companies and hold them accountable for exceeding the allowable outages, and raising concerns as well about the allegations of gaming, how these supposedly shortages resulting from unplanned outages somehow benefit them in some shape or form. And these came from DOE and ERC. So we think that retiring old and obsolete coal plants will help. And of course, that has to go hand in hand with expediting RE deployment and with a preferential bias on microgrids, community-based systems that allow communities to manage and own their own distributed renewable energy systems. But we also have to push financial institutions and banks to finance these projects and to ensure that we will have RE to fill in this gap.
Thank you, Ab. We have another question, which is an important one. And again, based out of the understanding in the Philippines, there's still hesitancy for banks to finance renewable energy projects without PSS power supply agreements. What other investment mechanisms that could help this dilemma to our massive target of RE installations, she asks? What can we learn from other markets and countries? And I'll ask both Mehdi Maybe Mehdi answers first, and then if you want to chime in, then you can too, Avril. Mehdi, what are the lessons from other countries and regions in this regard? Ari, because I know you're looking very closely at Bangladesh and South Asia, Ari's space.
Yeah. Okay, I can focus on first on solar, because that's the most popular RE here, RE technology are using here. So in India, it's now around 22% of the base load that's supplied by RE now, especially from solar. And in all over Asia, India is supplying cheapest solar power, which is in rupees or in Dhaka, I can say, but it's tough to say in in dollar. It's 2.3 rupees per unit or kilowatt per hour. And China is the biggest solar power, has the biggest solar power coverage in the globally. The Philippines around 19%, I think. Avril can focus on that. So the price of renewables are going down every day, and while the price of fossil fuel are going up every day. So there is, I think, commercially there is no viable, efficiency of fossil fuel anymore in this region, especially. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. All our speakers, you can respond to this because it's an important question. And of course, Avril. Are there, yes, Avril. Meanwhile,
Yes,
anybody with any more questions, we can take them right away, and then we can do the wrap up. Yes, Avril. Sorry.
Yes, definitely this is a risk for renewable energy projects when they don't have power supply agreements. We have two main recommendations. We've also outlined this in our switching on report. First is there needs to be development or improvement in our competitive selection process based on our assessment. The way these terms of reference are being formulated by distribution utilities, they unduly favor and provide preferential bias for fossil fuels. And because of this, it's more difficult for renewable energy projects to secure power supply agreements. But also maybe a mechanism that we can learn from another country, Vietnam, would be the green energy auctions. We know that DOE is finalizing the rules for the green energy auction. It's been over 2 years, and we hope that this will be concluded soon, because these auctions will ensure that the RE projects will have power supply agreements. And the higher we raise that ambition, currently it's at 2 gigawatts, but the higher we increase that, then we can have more RE come in with PSA secured.
Okay, Nora, yes, Nora.
And just to add to this question, because the question was, why is there this hesitancy for banks to finance renewable projects? And I really would like to highlight, it's because we have all these wrong solutions. If we pay billions of dollars to coal power producers or have an energy charter treaty, which is all supportive of these wrong solutions, then yeah, the hesitancy is very logical, I think. So we have to really push to end these wrong policies.
Absolutely. We need to push and push harder, and we shall. The code red on the climate has been sounded and needs to be heeded by the ADB. We are trying to tell them that the IPCC report is there. They need to take it on board much more. And therefore, even if it means that they go back to their drawing board with their policy draft, they must do it. It's not so important to come out with a policy, but to come out through meaningful consultation and taking on board all of climate science, to come out with the right policy, which will have the right impact on people and communities on the ground that will be impacted by this policy. We know from May 2021, when the draft energy policy paper was unveiled for public consultation to garner feedback, everyone struggled and tried to make sense of it, gave feedback. We don't think it has been taken on board enough. Through July and August was the period for, they said, continued consultations with stakeholders. And yet, August 16th, the draft, the working paper, has not been up to the expectations that were built up with the ADB, speaking the speak of being, looking towards the future, being fossil free, etc. Gas is fossil gas, not natural gas, as they position. All the other false solutions when it comes to WT, biomass, hydro, etc., are really something that we cannot stomach. Therefore, we are saying, please, no host on the 6th when the board sits. Please remember, the questions remain, the vagueness remains in the wording. Don't allow for it to be pushed through. Guidance notes are still not out there. We want to know what will guide the staffs when they look at projects. And therefore, we need to continue pushing. And I thank all the members of the press who've been with us. And we hope that you can carry our concerns and messages, our articulations from the 8-9 speakers clearly across to not just the public, but the bank and their directors. Please do it on our behalf, and thank you so much for staying the course with us. You are our hope that the bank will rethink and rejig their whole energy policy exercise. Otherwise, everything they've done till here will be really of no use and pretty meaningless from the people's point of view. The whole thing from May until end August was supposed to be a meaningful and inclusive consultation, which they did not do. Just having it in English means that they did not want to engage. They just wanted to posture as if they were engaging. Please do not allow that to go through. Stay with us, and thank you. Any questions that you have can still be emailed. You have the press kit. It has everything. Meanwhile, you can also contact our 8 speakers plus Ryan individually. Please feel free to do so and get more answers to your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jen, for bringing us on and live. Yes, thank you.